Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's get started with Week 54's Word Nerd Wednesday. Now, so far this series, we have looked at some great names. The names of elves and Valar, Ireneon Gil-galad, Fingon, Manwë Sulimo, Gildor and Glorian, and Varda. And then we spent last week looking at the regions of the island of Númenor. Today, we're actually going to look at two words from our Third Age Thursday reading. The first is going to come from The Man of the Moon Stayed Up Too Late. The other is going to come from our look at the incantation, Cold be hand and heart and bone. Now, tomorrow, in the second verse of The Man of the Moon, the unfortunate karaoke performance of Frodo, we read that the ostler has a tipsy cat that plays a five-string fiddle. What is an ostler, O-S-T-L-E-R, I hear you asking? I'm glad you asked. The word dates back to the 14th century and means stableman at an inn. That is, the person who looks after the horses. Now that explains why somebody shortly after hearing this suggests that Bob ought to learn his cat the fiddle, because Bob, who takes care of the horses at the Prancing Pony Inn, is their ostler. But where does the word come from? It's actually just a phonetic spelling of ostler, same word but with an H at the beginning, from Anglo-French hosteler. I'm sure I'm butchering these pronunciations. Don't even ask me to start figuring out French pronunciations. Old French hostelier, meaning innkeeper, or interestingly, steward in a monastery, dating back to the 12th century. Now, from that word comes the modern French word that you might know, hôtelier, in French. In the UK, it's hotelier, but in the US, we say hotelier, because. Now, it goes even further back than that to medieval Latin hostelarius, which meant the monk who entertains guests at a monastery. That's the same roots as the words hospital and hospitality. But don't confuse the ostler with the anesthesiologist or you might not wake up. His modern-day parallel is the valet who parks your car. Now, before we move on, I thought I should mention there is actually such a thing as a five-stringed fiddle. I had no idea. I'd never heard of it, so I dug into it. It's a variant version of a regular violin with an extra string at the bottom of the range. So instead of just the G, D, A, and E strings, it adds a lower C string. And that helps combine the pitch ranges of the violin and the viola, enabling a player to be more versatile. They're used mostly in swing, jazz, and, as the name of the poem suggests, fiddling. But The Man in the Moon is the second poem we'll read tomorrow. The first is the terrifying incantation, Cold be hand and heart and bone, sung by a barrow wight, and definitely not reaching the top 40 anytime soon. Now, I spent a great deal of time on Middle-earth Map Monday 2 weeks ago looking at the etymology of both barrow and downs, but I never looked at the denizens of those downs, the barrow wights. Now, for barrow, just look back to week 52, Middle-earth Map Monday. But let's take a closer look today at the word wight. The chapter Fog on the Barrow Downs has always been one of the most terrifying chapters, especially coming as early in the story as it does. And for those who play Lotro, let me confess that the first time I had to go into the Barrow Downs, my heart was pounding. Now, wight seems like a bit of a strange word, but I'd already seen it before Lord of the Rings, way back when I played Dungeons & Dragons. Now there, wights are described as intelligent undead humanoids that resemble armed and armored corpses. Now, it's not exactly what Tolkien's wights are, but they're similar enough that even on my first reading, I had a sense of what we were dealing with here. Interestingly, though, in Middle English, wight simply meant person. Now, Ring of Words, which is a tremendous resource, by the way, quotes a line from Chaucer that you might remember. In the Canterbury Tales, there's a knight whom Chaucer says was so noble, he never said anything unkind unto no manner wight, to any kind of person. Well, as it turns out, Tolkien himself actually uses the word wight that way at least once in The Lord of the Rings. In The Passing of the Grey Company, that's Book 5, Chapter 2, as Aragorn and the Grey Company are leaving to take the paths of the dead, some of the Rohirrim said, "They are elvish wights. Let them go where they belong, into the dark places, and never return." Now, the Rohirrim are not saying that Aragorn and his friends are undead elves, obviously. They just mean something like elf-like folk, with a hint of contempt or disapproval for what they're doing. Now, as time went on, the use of wight to mean a person took on a more negative or contemptuous connotation. In fact, the neutral sense was more or less obsolete by the 16th century, according to the Oxford English Dictionary. But around 1200, a narrower implying contempt or commiseration started to appear. That stayed around until the 19th century, in phrases like drunken wight, unlucky wight, and so on. But as early as the 10th century in Old English, the word wight also started to mean a supernatural creature such as a ghost or a demon. The first usage of the word wight in this sense in Old English is in the oldest surviving English translation of Mark chapter 6, verse 49, in which the Greek Latin phantasma, which means exactly what it sounds like, a phantasm or ghost, was translated into Old English as evil wight. Evil wight. I'm hoping I pronounced that right. I mean, that's just, I'm still figuring out the Old English, but it's Yfelwiht. So, although Tolkien says in the nomenclature that Barrow Wight was his own invention, it appears he actually forgot that he'd read it somewhere else. In 1869, William Morris, an early fantasy author who was definitely an influence on Tolkien, teamed up with an Eirikr Magnusson to translate an Icelandic saga called Grettis Saga, the story of Grettir the Strong, which Hammond and Skull say in their Reader's Guide. By the way, the Reader's Guide is not the Lord of the Rings Reader's Companion, so keep that straight. They say that Tolkien owned a copy of this translation, and the word Barrow Wight appears in it. The authors of Ring of Words also point out that Andrew Lang uses the word Barrow Wights, all one word, no hyphen, in an essay on the Norse sagas in his collection, Essays in Little, published in 1891, probably in reference to Morris and Magnusson's translation. Tolkien, of course, was certainly familiar with Andrew Lang. Lang was the editor of books of fairy tales that were popular in Tolkien's youth, and in fact, Tolkien's essay on fairy stories was originally presented in 1939 as a lecture in honor of Andrew Lang. So it's quite possible that Tolkien had read Lang's essay on the Norse sagas as well and saw the word there too. But look, let's be honest. Anybody who's ever written anything knows that sometimes you write things you think are original because you've forgotten where you read them. It's like Tolkien said himself to Humphrey Carpenter, a story grows like a seed in the dark out of the leaf mold of the mind, out of all that has been seen or thought or read that has long ago been forgotten, descending into the deeps. And folks, that's it for today's Word Nerd Wednesday. Come back next week as we wander the wide, wild, wonderful world of words weekly on Wednesdays. And if there's a word you want to know more about, please let me know by emailing bartleman@theprancingponypodcast.com. Please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, a monthly hangout with me, bonus episode, and more. And then please join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Third Age Thursday. If you're watching this on YouTube, like and subscribe. Please follow or subscribe in your podcast apps and follow @Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.